This is the village of Shenik, and there are no corporate boundaries for the village. It's wherever you think it is. But Shenik is in Upper Nazareth Township. That's the municipality in which we are presently located. The cemetery, the intersection up here divides two townships. So the cemetery is actually in Bushkill Township. Most of it. There's a very slight sliver on the southern end, which is part of this township. Okay, so that's where it is, and about the only other thing I can say is that, and there's a bit of irony to it, but the man who originally laid it out, George Klaus, now we're talking 1763 approximately. But he laid out the cemetery. I don't know if it involved any survey, actual physical survey or not, but he laid it out. And ironically, he was the first one buried in the cemetery. He died very prematurely, and I don't know why. But anyway, he wound up being the first one buried there in the cemetery. If you've been there, of course, you're familiar with the way it's laid out. The old part is divided up into the Moravian Church choir system. Now, when I say choir, that has nothing to do with music. It's according to your station in life. Single brothers, single sisters, children, and so forth. So that's the way the old cemetery is laid out. It's also fairly easy, if you know the death year, it's fairly easy to find a grave in the original Moravian cemetery because they were all buried in order. If you know the year, you just find the year and then you just go down the row until you find the tombstone. So that makes it somewhat simpler. So unless any of you have any burning questions about it, I'll leave it at that.
So I didn't really plan this out too much, but I brought, I have it sitting over there. It's kind of a joke, but you know, it's still pretty kind of serious to me. This is the family tree. This is the Dorf Linde in Auerbach, Gemeinde Karls, Bad Landkreis Karlsruhe. So in 2009, I went to Auerbach, and if you know, you see on his grave, born Baden-Durlach. Baden-Durlach is a non-existent principality in Baden. Baden still exists. And if you know the Huguenots, I have a little bit here. I actually still didn't translate this. When I went there in 2009, just like most things, you go to some place and you're not sure what you're looking for, except that you know you're in well, you have to figure out because there's more than one Auerbach, but that's not too hard because there's only one Baden-Durlach. But so when I got there, I talked to some people in town, and people would point out what's the most prominent thing in town. Well, that's the little picture I have here of the little explanation. You can't read it right. This is just before you have smartphones, but they would say, well, the tree, everything happened in the tree in town. The tree's like 800 years old. So that's why you know that they knew the tree. I took a couple of the pictures around. And so the Huguenots, as we know, they come out of France, as Louisa leaves Genf. I call it Genf because I don't use French words for Geneva, Switzerland. I use the German words. They came there and they received protection from Markgraf of Baden. If you look in the Clewell books, you see there's a pass granted. So that's when if you think about, we have French connections, but all French Huguenots, I would say 90% of French Huguenots that settle Pennsylvania are Germanized. They are not French by the time they come. They spend 25, 30 years under protection of German principalities in Europe. The only other thing worth mentioning, and these are things that take years to figure out, and everyone can, over time you put it together, it's the 9 Years' War, the War of Palatine Succession, 1709, Louis XIV says, I'm going to turn the platinum to hell on earth. And that's the Sun King, if you ever heard of him, a pretty famous guy. And he lit the platinum on fire. I mean, it's atrocious. And that's why, of course, they have to come to Pennsylvania. So a couple of things like that. I also, later on, hopefully in a year or so, with Conrad's son, Christian and I, we're putting together 3 different connections of why are the Clewells Moravian. It's all a matter of opinion. Somebody could sort of, but the Clewells, as in Franz and George Clewell, they weren't Moravian on their own. The reason how they come in is through a guy named Lurch. I have that there. He's a Moravian missionary, a minor Moravian missionary, and they did a lot of work in the Tulpehocken out in Berks County. And Anna Elizabeth Wineland, whose husband was John Nicholas Wineland. John Nicholas was one of the came over on a ship himself. He marries her, and her mother is Susan Philippina Lurch. And this connects in, and those people, along with a guy named Eschbach, and 3 Mohican Indians that are baptized out at Ole, 1742. Tremendously awesome story. Those characters are the apostles to the Clewells. That's what will be presented. As in, that's what brought them in directly to Moravian faith. And like I said, we're going to kind of present that because I think it's important to know why did they particularly become Moravian. Okay, the Kirk House, it's the most famous spot. That in the Sacred Oak. The Sacred Oak is a very big part of the story. So the Moravians are out there at 42, Zinzendorf with the connections. He brings the 3 guys, Schupp, Jacob, and Isaac. Yeah, he brings them from Shaker-Makel Mission, Dutchess County, New York. They bring them out, and they're baptized there as a testimony and as a witness to unchurched Germans, because the Moravians want to bring all unchurched Germans, because Zinzendorf wants to make one German church in Pennsylvania. Had it happened, we'd probably speak German to this day, because then all Mennonites, all Amish, everyone would be under one church body. They would have been, they would have never stopped the power of the German pietists. But they didn't get together. But we have a direct line to the Moravian missions, a minor Moravian missionary, but Georg Lurch and his wife, they're both buried at Nazareth Cemetery. And they were instrumental in everything that went on in the missions to the Indians of Pennsylvania. And they were there, in fact, when Shikellamy, the great Shikellamy, if you ever heard of up at Sunbury, that was the original Shomoko mission. With the day Shikellamy died, after he was in Bethlehem for 6 to 7 days, he made and these are all very voluntary. He made a true confession of his faith. He was weeping. He was very sick. They walked him from Bethlehem. They took him out to the Tulpehocken. He was with Georg Lurch, which is again the wife of Franz, her father. Her grandfather. They cared for him. They walked him back, and he died December 6, 1748. He was the most powerful, Native American in all of Pennsylvania. He had the authority of the 6 nations. And Lurch was there. We can't find out more except the reference that with Zeisberger and everyone else, he was there, and he buried him in the ground. He held his hand, prayed with him. So we have a very unique, very amazing stuff. Just takes a long time to put the clues together, and sadly, you can often only find like one sentence, and then you go from there. But
This is very short. My sister and I wanted to share a 177-year-old Bible that was in our family, and it was a Bible that was owned by Christina Clewell, who was George Clewell's granddaughter, through Francis. And in 1845, she gifted this Bible. It's the New Testament and has a few little etchings and things in there. And she gifted it to James D. Kern, a president for Miss Christina Clewell, September 27, 1845. So we know who Christina Clewell is. We don't know who James D. Kern is. So if anyone knows of a James D. Kern, that completes the puzzle. But it's just a lovely little Bible, and we're donating it to the Clewell family.
My dad was the 1959 coordinator for the Clewell family reunion. His father was Charles W. Laux, who was one of the historians for the 1907 Bible, and Ephraim Laux was one of the members here who was in charge of the Christian education at that time. But to bring us forward, what I'm going to do is ask you all to contemplate giving a little bit of your saliva or a little blood, but a little sample so that we can track and see how many of the cousins actually have genetic snippets, which is like a little sentence in a paragraph. And you have 23 chromosomes, and these little snippets oftentimes will show you that you have real, true genetic ties between one another. Now, we did this for the Laux family back in 2007. We had 65 gentlemen there who were all Lauxes. There's 30 different spellings to that last name. But they all elected to go ahead and do the genetics. 64 out of the 65 guys had the exact same Y chromosome, which is kind of cool. Now, it's easier for men to men to men to men because the Y is not changed at all. There's no communication across the X chromosome. So if we have a Clewell that we know is Clewell, all the way up either George or France, then we can, if their genes, their Y chromosomes match, then we know that that's what Francois was over there in France. So we can track the genes across the territories. You can track the lineage of the communities just by tracking this stuff back to see where it came from. I know where the Laux family tree came from. Came out of Africa, went up into Baghdad area, then over towards Uzbekistan, up the Ural Mountains, across Russia, down to southwestern France, which is where the Laux side of the family came from. The Clewell side is not too far from there. I mean, if it's Grenoble, southeastern France, that's probably where all the Clewells originate. And so, but I would find it very interesting to see how much of this room has identical snippets of genes within every one of you here that is part of the Clewell family.
That would be cool.
So it's and then so you can get 23andMe. There's Family Tree. There's Heritage, MyHeritage. There's multiple different companies out there putting out different sets of genetic structure. The most complete probably is Hudson Alpha in Huntsville, Alabama, but they do it actually for medical purposes as well as just straight genealogy. Now, when you get your what's called a GEDCOM, which is your data, if you take your GEDCOM and upload it to a company called GEDmatch, and that's GED Match, GEDmatch.com, that's when your data becomes accessible across the entire spectrum of genes. So what you get is a report where you can get a listing with the GEDmatch, with the family tree DNA. I had basically a page and a half of folks that said that they were matched. When I went to the GEDmatch, here I wind up with about 10 pages and over 1,000 folks that have similar DNA matches to my match, to my DNA. Now, I'm not going to go through everybody and call them up and say, hey, you're a cousin of mine, because that's just crazy. But it is kind of interesting to see how that data occurs. But what also was interesting was that the perfect matches were all Lauxes. Some different spellings, L-O-U-C-K-S, L-O-U-X, you know, one of the 30 different varieties of how the name got transferred across the years. But I would find it very interesting if we would do that and kind of, you know, just everybody grab your DNA, a little swab, a little spit in the cup, send it off to them. A couple of weeks later, you get the match back.
All right, for 2021, the necrology. Glenn G. Young, Kathleen M. Mittman-Milheim, Ernst, Linda Faye Fair Reppert, Joan Elizabeth Clewell Paulus, Claire Andrew Fair Jr., Benedict W. Ben P. Lanari, Shirley May Umstead Truman, Arlene Jane Quare Peischer, Gladys Shell Milheim, James Henry Roth, Lorraine Laurie Ubel Trinkley, Linda Rose Barth Young, Jean Allen Stocker, Geraldine May Weiss Gower, Bernice Irene Minnick Cucker, Donald Burley, Virginia Alice Ginny Stocker Broke, Delbert R. Fainel, Thomas L. Fair, Gladys S. Ruch Milheim, Joy E. Lewis Schallenberger, Richard Nelson Clewell Jr., Betty May Schallenberger Warner, Linwood Clewell, Betty Jane Butler Fair, Joan Dorothy Clewell Roth, Geraldine S. Kemmerer Carell, Ruth Elaine Anna Roth Kern, Karen Ann Warner Silvius, Gloria M. Nolf Wombold, Jewel Cardwell Field, Drew E. Young, and two more that are not on this list that I can add, Wilford Drager and Betty Jane Frace Stocker.